one of the tenets of Darwin's evolution through natural selection was there is what in the population? Variation. So sexual reproduction allows for more variation than asexual reproduction. Because in asexual reproduction, the only variation you get would be any mistakes in DNA replication. Otherwise, you're making an exact copy of yourself. Which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Depends on the environment and the costs and benefits. If the environment is perfectly good for you, why change anything? You're perfect for your environment, just make more copies of yourself. If you're not perfect, then you might be better off finding somebody else who's maybe a little better in some respects. Well, he's perfect.
What?
The rest of us humans might need to mix up our genes with other genes from other people and get some variation so that some of our offspring might be better off than we are. So that's the cost and benefit that he was referring to, that if sexual reproduction actually costs more energetically, and it does, why would you want to switch to that? Because asexual reproduction is so much more efficient. Well, and that's why they're interested in under what conditions would organisms actually switch. If you can do both, why not do the least costly one, which makes exact copies of yourself? So that's one of the questions. And there was a bigger question which their experiment actually was not designed to answer, but they made it sound like it was. So what was the bigger question? Yes, ma'am. So why did sexual reproduction evolve? This experiment wasn't really designed to answer this question, but they made it sound like it was. And then all these other people who critiqued their work, they said, well, this experiment doesn't really answer that question. It helps you with this one, doesn't really answer that one. So that's why I'm harping on this, that you have to be able to figure out, okay, what question is this experiment actually designed to answer? So what's the question? What are the hypotheses? What would the experimental prediction? Do you support the hypothesis? So this experiment was designed to answer this question. We really eventually would like to know the answer to this one, but this experiment doesn't really answer that one. All right, so for the experiment they designed, what are the independent, dependent, and standardized variables? What did they manipulate? Yes, sir. All right, so the food and the environment. And what are the levels? All right, so uniform, plentiful. There are two more. Uniforms, scarce resources, and the third one was, it was a variable combination. So half the environment they were living in, one side of it had a lot of food and the other side of it did not have a lot of food. So it was a combo. So that's your independent variable, and it had three different levels. What's the dependent variable? What do they measure? Yes, ma'am. Offspring. So they didn't look at the actual mature offspring. So they only looked at the eggs that were produced. And they looked at them in proportions. So they measured the proportions. And whether they were from sexual versus asexual. And the good thing about rotifers is that you can tell them by color. The eggs look different depending on how they're produced. Now, they did mention at least one standardized variable. Yes, sir. I suppose you could consider the species to be... Yes, sir. The ability to migrate. Because in the variable combination environment, the animals were allowed to migrate between the site that had a lot of food and the site that didn't. They had to provide that ability to migrate for the other two treatments also, between areas that had little food to other areas that had little food, or between areas that had plenty of food to other areas that just had plenty of food. So the environment was uniform, but they could move around. So that was standardized. And what did they find? Yes, ma'am. So in the varied environment, you got more asexually reproduced eggs. That's better. And was it overwhelming? Only 15% versus 7%. So yeah, twice as much, but still not that much. And then they redid the experiment after 14 weeks. So why did they redo the experiment? Yes, sir, good luck. So since the sexual reproduction rates for all groups had dropped, they decided to combine all the populations and then redo this. And when they redid it, what happened? Isn't it? I'm sorry, say that one more time. Very good question. So I don't think they did that. I think what they did was they took all of the original populations after 14 weeks, mixed them all, and then resampled into the 3 different environments. And then what happened then was that this time, because the animals have had 14 weeks to adjust to this artificial environment, you didn't see a total drop in sexual reproduction in all populations. You only saw the drop in the homogeneous environments, but you saw an increase in the heterogeneous environments. And then they said, yes, we have an answer. The sexual reproduction goes up in the heterogeneous environment, which would potentially make evolutionary sense that if your environment is variable, sexual reproduction is what you want. That gives you more variation in the next generation. It does not answer why sexual reproduction evolved, but it does give you a reason when it would be beneficial. So when you would switch to it if you had the ability already, as opposed to why did it evolve in the first place? So that's a different question, much harder to answer. So far so good? Yes, sir. So at the end of the 14 weeks, you had the population of rotifers that were taken out of the wild and put into an artificial environment that had low food. Another population taken from the wild, put into an artificial environment that had high food, and another group from the wild that was put in a variable environment. So at the end of the 14 weeks, they took these populations that had been growing for 14 weeks in these artificial environments, mixed them all. and then redivided them. It's not how one would normally design an experiment, but you kind of have to work with what you have. So that's what they did, isn't it? It's an interesting experiment. It's actually a very simple experiment, and it does give you some interesting results. Any other questions about this article? Yes.
Why did they start it? Because the sexual reproduction rates have dropped.
So, in animal lineages, most animals don't do asexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is the norm. In many other groups of organisms, asexual reproduction is the norm. And in some groups of organisms, you have both. And then depending on which, what the environmental factors are, you might switch. So I don't know how many of you actually have any flowering plants at home.
I do.
Maybe a few of you, this is New York City, so most people don't garden. Sometimes you might notice that your flowering plant hasn't flowered for a really, really long time.
Yeah, it hasn't flowered.
And then all of a sudden it flowers.
Yeah, and then okay.
Now, depending on which species you're dealing with, it could be flowering because all of a sudden you remember to fertilize it. And so you gave it nutrients and now it's happy. Or it might be flowering because you've been ignoring it for a really long time. And so the environment is really, really bad for the plant because you've been ignoring it. And it's flowering because flowering is the mode of sexual reproduction for plants, for flowering plants. And so because you've been ignoring it and it's been suffering, it's switching to sexual reproduction. We try to create seeds for the next generation that are variable in traits, so that some of them might survive in this awful environment that you have created for your plant. So sometimes if you want your plant to flower, you have to torture it to flower, because otherwise if it's happy, it will just go through normal vegetative reproduction and it will not flower. It's not quite waterboarding, but now some flowers flower at a specific time no matter what you do to them because they're on a schedule, so they will just flower at a certain time. But other flowers, if they're not going to waste their energy blooming if they don't have to. Right. So what I want to do next is go back to photosynthesis, especially the carbon fixation parts. We're going to do a quick review of the Galvin cycle, and then take a look at the problems with oxygen. I have a couple of questions for you to practice with. And then somebody asked a question about the Jaeger experiment, so if you have time to go back to that also.